Okay, awesome. So welcome everyone to today's talk on creating a brighter future with remote governance. First, I'll introduce the speakers. One who certainly needs no introduction, Esther Derby, who's got the book 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change out at the moment, which you can find on her website, and is also frequently dropping bombs of wisdom on the world with her Change by Attraction podcast. The other speaker, who also needs very little introduction, probably one of the forerunning minds of agility in the APAC region, and also has his own podcast of the Agile Revolution, is Tony Ponton, who will also be taking us through some wonderful work with remote governance today. Just on a bit of admin, I'll be in the messages, so if you've got any questions or concerns, feel free to hit me up there. And towards the end of the talk, we'll also have a space for people to ask any other questions that they might have. Feel free to log those questions in the chat as well and have a bit of discussion as we go along. Without further ado, over to our illustrious speakers.
Hi, I'm Tony, and obviously that's Esther. She doesn't need any introduction, and we'll be talking to you about remote governance and creating a brighter future. And if I can get the application to work, it'd be really great. So what I wanted to do before we got started, I just want to introduce the framework for, so some of you may have seen it, you may have heard of it, but this is the Remote Agility Framework. And it really is one of the world's first enterprise grade frameworks for remote working. And it's modular by its design. And you can see that it scales across both enterprise and team layer and the team of teams layer. And then the intent of it is to enable organizations to purposefully design their ways of working to suit both the fully remote, the distributed or hybrid or remote-ish as we call it, at remote AF type models. So around January 2020, we started developing this and we began the journey of creating the framework. And we thought in order to stress test our ideas, it would be really great to get a panel of people whose expertise really spanned many of the things that we were thinking about and the modules we were designing, because we wanted to challenge it in these workshops and really garner their feedback, but also make sure we weren't just completely crazy. Amazingly, one of those people that we got on the panel was Esther Derby. And as we spoke and as we talked, it became really obvious that the work that Esther had been doing and the work that myself and a couple of others have been doing around remote governance in the challenge workshops was really very close and very aligned with the whole framework. So you can imagine my joy when through further discussion, we agreed to start to work together and create the remote governance framework and pattern using the work that Esther had done and the work that I'd done with the team. So today, myself and Esther will be the ones talking to you about the remote working and the governance and the aspect of the framework. However, this is a team effort. So
we don't even know whether there will be an operational issue on the weekend.
I'd like to quickly introduce you to the rest of the team. That's the joys of always working in remote. You get lots of fun with people popping in, so it's fine. So obviously, the two at the top, you don't need to know too much about. You've heard about us today. James is the other one. He's really experienced in agile transformations, and he's been around high-performing teams and organizations building from the ground up. And he likes to say he speaks the language of the boardroom and the development team and the real person. Then we have Dave Martin. He's our guru, if we like, of enterprise coaching and specializing in large-scale transformational work and learning organizations, and he's worked with industries across telcos and financial services, healthcare, industrial, so a very large span of information. And then there's Farnaz. So Farnaz Vahab is a really experienced culture person and leadership coach. She's got more than 15 years of experience in the Agile movement and working in financial insurance. And to be honest with you, she organizes all of us, so she's fantastic as well. And then we have Nat. And Nat's been doing Agile and Lean experiential stuff ranging from small startups to businesses for a very long time. She's a real passionate architect of change. And also she architects many of the patterns in terms of what you're going to see in terms of today. So that's a quick snapshot. Now they will be with us today. When we get to the questions and answers section, you'll find that Esther and I will stop talking and we're going to let the team talk, because this is really a group effort. as I said, we might be the mouthpieces today, but this is their baby as much as it was ours. So without further ado, I'll let Esther start the talk.
Well, before I start though, I just want to say that it has been just a wonderful experience working with this group. Thinking together with this group has been super duper fun, and it's just a joy to work with such smart people who have really good ideas and can build on other people's ideas. So it's really just been a joy. So now, what do we mean by governance? Traditional governance sounds really heavyweight, and in remote situations, you may retain part of that traditional governance as they relate to the board, to shareholders, to fiduciary responsibilities. However, remote governance has a different focus. It's really focused on creating clarity, conditions, and constraints that enable the entire organization to function. To borrow a quote from Donella Meadows, who wrote Thinking in Systems, remote governance seeks to, and here's the quote, provide enough central control to achieve coordination towards the larger system goal and enough autonomy to keep all the subsystems flourishing, functioning, and self-organizing. So we're really taking a systems and complexity informed approach to governance rather than one of top-down control. So what makes remote governance challenging? The first thing is that there's an issue of trust. Now, professional trust requires that people feel confident that others are competent to do their work, they're committed to getting their work done, and they'll communicate. Obviously, remoteness makes this much more challenging. Managers can't stay in touch with teams by walking around and having casual conversations, and leaders can't see their people, so they worry they might not be working hard. And then they get in the weeds and they micromanage. They get mired in detailed task tracking or monitoring, which causes resentment, and it reduces everybody's focus on outcomes.
So when we think about that, we take it a little bit further and we think about, all right, what are people trying to do in that whole virtual space, right? And what we see and what we know that makes it different when we move into the remote frame or the hybrid is that you can't do in physicality or digitality what you've been doing in physicality. And I use that word digitality, you hear me use that a little bit today. That means the art of working and living in a digital environment. And that's what people are doing when they move into a remote space, right? Your home is in your work and your work is in your home. So you can't recreate physical things that you did or attempt to because they don't work. And, to give you an example of that, we often see people trying to use the Kanban boards or the physical boards up here whilst they're on camera and people are going to sleep, right? So you have to think about how you're going to change that frame to allow people to be able to work in the best way possible. The second part of moving into remote and hybrid that we see that makes it really challenging for any organization and the leaders and the people within that organization is that perceived loss of control, right? There's no longer, the people are no longer where you could just walk over and talk to them. And, it creates a whole micromanagement and a command and control type space where the way to try and get back that control is to be in every single meeting, is to attend every single moment, to ensure that you know every single thing that your people are doing. And, even to the point of, I think, Esther, you've got a great example around that, around surveillance type issues.
Oh, yeah. In response to having the workforce go remote, many companies installed tracking software on company-owned devices. Stuff that tracks the websites, the apps, some have facial recognition software. Some companies required people to install surveillance software on their personal machines as a condition of employment. Now, one recent survey reported that the number of companies using surveillance software on their employees has doubled. Now, companies that sell this sort of software talk about providing valuable insights about who's productive and who's not. But this type of monitoring increases stress, it reduces trust, it robs people of autonomy, and dampens collaboration, innovation, and engagement. It produces the exact opposite of what leaders and managers say they want. So, how do we address these challenges with remote governance?
So the first thing we want to think about is how do we, as you said, Esther, how do we address those challenges with remote governance? So we want to make most of the remote space, and that's one of the things that we see, and part of the thing that brought us together in thinking about how we would bring this framework to organisations, because the remote space can be very powerful and you can use it well. But we need to make the most of it in ensuring that we're using it so that we don't fall into the trap of creating this perceived loss of control and the micromanagement and being every meeting and having to be synchronous about everything that we're doing. The second part to that is really thinking about how we're going to actually challenge these control mechanisms, right? We have to challenge that perceived loss of control. We have to peel away those organizational layers of detritus around the control mechanisms that we've put in place. And I like to use a little example here. You know, we hosted a few months ago a panel interview with some executives from organizations, and one of them was saying one of the things that they'd found during this whole pandemic was they sent everyone home very quickly and everybody was doing their work. And to actually allow people to do their work and get the job done as quickly as they could, because they couldn't keep up with it, is that they took away a lot of their control mechanisms that had always had in place, and the work still got done and nothing happened. And so now that they've started to mature, they're actually looking at all of those mechanisms and challenging them, saying, do we really need those? Are those the ones that we had? Because some of those ones are, that's the way we always did it. We don't even know why we're still doing them anymore, right? So it's actually looking at those and thinking about those mechanisms that are going to allow you to work in a way that doesn't create that loss of control, that doesn't exacerbates all of those things that stops you from being able to do the work that you need to do. And that flows into thinking about our system of work in general. So as we talk about governance, let's be really clear. What we mean is the whole of the system of work, not your PMO or your project or your stage gates. We want to revisit and revamp the system of work to work in the hybrid or remote frame, because you have a lot of different ways that you need to think about it, asynchronous versus synchronous, the health of your team members. How do you get that water cooler kind of conversation happening? What's the stuff that we need to work, the tools and the technology? And that means alongside that, leaders have taken a big hit. Now, I talk about adjust leadership styles. This is not to say that leaders are bad. In fact, I think leaders have taken actually quite a large hit in this, is that a lot of leaders are burned out because, the moving into the remote frame hasn't done them any favors either, because as we said, they've had to spend a lot of time and a lot of meetings they probably would never have done. And some of that is by pure fact that the mechanisms or the system of work is not set up. The second part of that is the typical leadership style that they may have used over the years is not suited to that. So we want to think about leading with intent. And in terms of that means then we have to think about the things that are on the right of this particular diagram that Esther's going to talk to you about.
Yeah, I think the first thing is we really have to focus on creating clarity. And that means that people throughout the organization, throughout the company, understand how their work fits in. They can focus on outcomes for customers and for the company. Clarity is essential for aligning effort and decentralizing decision-making so that we can have faster and more appropriate decisions. They have to make accommodations for collapsing contexts. When work is home and home is work and school and daycare and whatever else, it's just not reasonable to demand that people be present 9 to 5 or spend their entire day in Zoom meetings. We have to think about what work is best done synchronously and what works just as well asynchronously. When do people really need to meet, check in, sync up? That cadence is likely to be very, very different in a remote workplace than it was when people were face to face. We have to rebuild networks. Lots of work and learning happens through these informal networks and webs of relationship in companies. And lots of those networks fractured in the great move to remote. Without the water cooler, without the lunchroom, without bumping into people over coffee, those opportunistic cross-pollinizing conversations went away, and silos got reinforced because there's no time to talk to people in all structured meetings. So we have to rebuild those networks, and we can do that. We can do that online. Many of us are tightly connected to people that we have only ever met online, but it takes attention and it takes sanctioning social interaction. So, on one hand, we need more structure in remote meetings, but part of that structure needs to include some kind of social interaction. And we have to create avenues for people to get to know people from other parts of the organization. So we get some of that synergistic learning and people who understand what's going on in other parts of the organization. We have to reestablish feedback loops. Like our networks, many of our, especially informal feedback loops broke. And without feedback, people can't course correct quickly. So we really need to look at the feedback loops are still there and make sure they're still the right ones and build new ones. So Tony, why don't you tell us about the remote pillars of governance?
Be my pleasure. So as a group with the Remote AF, there was a group of us that came together who'd been working in the distributed frame for many years, and now thrown much into the remote frame. And what we did was, through that group and that team, we distilled down to what we call the pillars of remote governance. And essentially, every successful remote governance or governing your entire system requires really building that culture of distributed governance, taking authority to the work, while still keeping and retaining those control levers that you need. It really is about demanding that sense of responsibility and ownership to allow for building the greater levels of trust, as we talked about before, right? And so we distill that down to the pillars of governance, and they're really a set of overarching meta patterns, if you like, that define and describe the attributes that are required to effectively govern your remote systems of work. And one of the things I want to say about this is if you have a look at it, we have it as a balanced set. And the reason that we do that is because if any of these levers are not working in concert with the others, or if you don't have a balanced view of this, then the organization becomes out of kilter. And you'll find that as you work with organizations, or you will have experienced that, I'm quite sure, with the organizations that you're working with, that some of these things are out of kilter, and therefore that creates an organizational imbalance. So when we look at it, we have the 4 pillars, and the first of those is transparency. Now, transparency is an oft muttered thing, but we call it rational transparency, right? It's actually thinking rationally about what you're going to be transparent about and what you're not going to be transparent about. So the reality of it is we need to make some things transparent as much as we possibly can. There are some things in organizations that you literally can't, but it's actually being honest about those things and why you can't, and being transparent as to why you won't share those, right? And it's thinking about the mechanisms of those. So what we talk about it's the ability to radiate information from the organization to the organization, and using what we call the janitor theory. So if you've ever heard that conversation before, it's JFK walked into NASA, he walked up when they were doing the moon landing, walked up to the janitor and said, "Hey, what's your job here?" And he said, "I'm helping put people on the moon." He had that strategic link, right? He knew what the strategic link to what he was doing, to his delivery. So we talk about that. We talk about the fact that you want to be able to transmit that information both asynchronously and synchronously, and we use things like digital obeyer. So instead of the big obeyer rooms that you would have used in physicality once upon a time, now we try and do that in digitality. We want to have that collaborative and that remote dynamic planning, which then brings the ability for us to push that information up to the organization. And we want to be able to decompose that strategy from the strategy level down to the team, so everybody understands the direction of travel that we're trying to achieve. And to help that is that digitalization, that visualization of that work and flow. So it's really about being able to give the right information for the right organization, for the right people, so they can get it at the right time. That allows them to make the right directional decisions. And that flows into leadership. And when we think about leadership, we talk about leadership in terms of remote leadership, right? And we're talking about leading with intent. So many of the leadership problems that we've seen over many years aren't new, and everybody's aware of those. So I'm not going to bang on about those, but what we say is when you move into the remote or the hybrid, the remote-ish, these problems are exacerbated. So what do we do about that? So what we would want to do is we want to lead with intent. We want to ensure that we think more about our bounded autonomy, and we give our people clear guide rails. We push the work down and the decisioning down to the people so that they can make those decisions as close in person, place and time as possible to the work that's being done. That doesn't mean we just give it carte blanche. Obviously, as you said, as I said before, it's bounded autonomy, clear guide rails, but people understand what they need to do. There's not a learned helplessness. They're not being bored out and sitting there and waiting to be told what to do. They can get on and do it. And that means if you're going to do that, we really have to think about amplifying the kind of communication and what can we do asynchronously versus synchronously. How can we make ourselves more available for team one-on-ones? We have a really good friend who uses Visual Facilitator, the application, and he actually has an on-ready room and sits in that room all day, available. Anyone from the organization can ping him. Very clear decision-making guide rails. That's those guide rails and that bounded autonomy, right? And clear and consistent messaging around those so people understand what they're doing. And, you know, one of the biggest things about leading with intent is if you ask some of the great luminaries like Jack Welch, when he was asked, for example, what's your version of leadership? He said, my job is to enable my people to get the hell out of the way so they can get the work done. So we want to spend more time in leadership, you know, clearing those blockers and directing effort. That brings us to systems. If you're going to do all of this, your leadership and transparency, you've got to have the systems of work, the remote systems of work. So we have to think about purposefully designing the system of work to embrace that digitality that we talked about. Home is in your work, work is in your home, and all of the digital things that go with it. And we want to be able to create what we call the collaborative connected tissues of the organizational constructs. In other words, we want to enable the ability for the information to flow both horizontally and vertically across the organization. And what we see is when we move into this digital environment, that often that's truncated and therefore the information's not flowing backwards and forwards, directional decisions are not being able to be made. So in a leadership sense, then they're making them on gut-based or not fact-based decisions, right? So how do we do that? Well, we enable those virtual workplaces with purposeful design and thinking about how we're going to do that. We work with our teams to really craft those social contracts and those ways of working that enable the team and that they're engaged with working in. And making sure that we shorter cadence all the things that we would have done before. You know, we can't have these long tail planning and 3-year plans, because let's face it, if I have to talk to you about the VUCA that's out there and use that word pandemic, then I think we've all been missing for a while, right? And if that means that we have to be able to adapt, and we have to actually be able to move and plan and shape, and our systems need to be able to help, our work need to be able to craft around that. We also, if we're going to do all of that, then we really need to provide, you know, that known knowledge or that practices and process guides that allow you to uplift that remote capability so that people are able to get the work done. They know where the information is. They don't have to try and find it, because a lot of our organizational information over the years has been hidden away in the SharePoints and things like that, or they could go and find someone. But when you're working from home, that's not necessarily so. Last one's information, right? So it underpins everything. It's that flow of information that enables and underpins all of the pillars, transparency, leadership, systems. So how do we do that? Well, we want to think about that in terms of, if we moved into digitality, we want to look at what information we really need, right? So we want to look at getting the data from the source systems over opinion to allow us to have that transparency, to allow us to make those fact-based decisions, to allow our operations and our systems to flow. And we want to reflect that digitally in, using the obeyers or using those informations or those dynamic dashboards that allow us to get those insights as quickly as we can. And that means we need to, it's an offset thing, you got to, measure the right things. Well, this becomes even more important when you move into remote or hybrid, because a lot of the metrics and measures and things that we were using, they don't actually work anymore. And in fact, I was working with a company just a little while ago where they're still running their stuff off a spreadsheet, and it had 300 and I don't know how many lines of stuff on it. And when we went through that, the actual stuff they were using was 2 or 3 lines of that reporting. You don't have time in this VUCA environment, even more now that you've moved into remote and hybrid, to actually do that. So we need to look at that and how can we surface that information, the information that we need that enables every layer of the organization to do what they need to do and enables the bounded autonomy and the guide rails. So again, you need all 4 of those pillars working in concert to assure that governing the system is effective and it's optimal for your organization. So you really have to have that balance. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to let Esther talk about the scene model, because this is part of the journey that we've been on, is melding the 2 together.
Yeah, this is when we first started talking about remote governance together. This was one of the pieces that seemed like it really connected the work that you had been doing with the work that I had been doing. And it's become one of the underlying patterns for remote governance. So the SEAM model, I first started talking about this in 2014 or so. So some of you may have heard about this before. It's a way of looking at an organization, but rather than focus on levels of hierarchy, the SEAM model looks at 3 domains or sets of concerns that exist in every organization, whether it's 5 people to 500,000 people. And the domains are steering, enabling, and enhancing, and making. So for steering, the fundamental questions that need to be answered are: where are we going? How will we get there? What difference do we make in the world? What's our revenue model? How do we relate to our customers? For enabling and enhancing, they have to answer the question: how can we support people who create products and deliver services? How can we flow work smoothly into teams? How can we create the bounded autonomy for teams to make decisions that will speed up their ability to get work and to respond to new challenges? And the making domain looks at how can we use our combined skills and work together effectively to deliver those products and services. Now, these domains are fractal in nature. So in a large organizations, these questions must be answered for the entire entity, but also for divisions and departments. Now, the SEAM model serves me as both a diagnostic and a dialogic tool. So it's a way for people to talk about what's going on in the organization. It enables those conversations so they can really focus their attention on getting the right work done at the right time by the right people. As it applies to governance, the SEAM model really focuses attention on how the decisions in the steering domain impact the other domains. So within each, we look at system influencers, clarity, conditions, and constraints, which are factors that we can adjust to shape patterns of action, interaction, and results within the organization. So clarity aids with alignment and enables local decision-making. Conditions mean that people and teams have the means to actually do their work, and that policies and structures support them rather than hinder them. And we can't just assume that the conditions that supported co-located work will enable remote or hybrid work. Sometimes they actually get in the way. Constraints establish bounded autonomy, and they communicate what behavior is desired, what's tolerated, what's discouraged. So some of the challenges here are we have to understand and identify meaningful ways to evolve the system of governments as a whole within your context. Now, as with any complex system, you can't just overlay something new and expect it to work. You have to understand what holds the current pattern in place and how the new change is going to interact with that existing pattern. You know, everything touches everything. And if you don't pay attention to that underlying pattern and carefully remove some parts of it or loosen some of the constraints or tighten them, you know, based on what's going on, the old pattern is going to reassert itself. And everything touches everything. So we need to pay attention to, you know, if we do this, how is it going to affect something over here? How is it going to impact other parts of the system? We have to establish the basis for trust in remote spaces. And I talked earlier about the elements of professional trust, you know, competence, commitment, and communication. Attending to clarity, conditions, and constraints, another set of 3 C's, create the conditions for people to show up as trustworthy. Because if your conditions get in the way of people actually doing their work, people show up as incompetent, which erodes trust. You know, if the constraints are such that people can't make good decisions, they don't have the information to make good decisions, they're going to show up as untrustworthy, right? So you have to create the conditions where people can actually be and appear competent. And for managers to know that there are guardrails there to, you know, to prevent things from going off the rails and people making big mistakes. You have to increase the zone of transparency in a rational way. Now, in most organizations, knowledge has a tendency to bifurcate. So the people at the top have all the contextual knowledge, you know, the stuff that the steering domain pays attention to, and the people at the bottom know what it takes to get things done day to day. Well, that bifurcation is actually a recipe for distrust and undesirable outcomes, because the people at the top, you know, don't necessarily understand what it takes to get work done. So they set deadlines that might not make any sense. You know, it's like, what can take so long? It's just a database. And on the other hand, the people at the bottom of the organization who lack contextual knowledge either have to sit and wait to be told what to do, or they make mistakes because they don't understand the business model. They don't understand the customers. So rational transparency is about increasing that shared pool of knowledge, which allows for better, faster, and more local decisions. And it's entirely the foundation for leading by intent.
So building on that, what we've done, as you can see by this diagram, which is just a taster, because obviously this is a very small session today, so we're not going to get into all of the patterns that we've created, but we have created a structured set of patterns that provides the leaders in the organizations with a way to do these things that you're hearing that we're talking about. And we'd like to introduce that as the remote governance system. So you can see by that diagram that we've taken those things that Esther was just talking about, and we've merged the pillars using that steering, enabling and enhancing the making with the clarity, conditions and constraints to allow us to actually lead organizations through how they might change and how they might look at their remote governance in a total set. And we do that because we know that we have to think about some of these other things like purposeful adjustment of the leadership for the remote spaces. So we talked about it before. It's easy to say leadership's here and leadership's that, and we're doing this, and how do we adjust that? What we want to do is think about how we purposefully adjust that, because we have to think about it in the context of each organization and each remote space, because they're vastly different in the context of the work, in context of the structure. You know, there could be have people in all parts of the different world. So it's actually thinking about how we're going to lead in that way. This system allows us to look at those things along with, you know, the things that Esther was just talking about. And also what we want to do, you heard me talk about it before, and my team always gives me a bit of fun over the words collaborative connective tissues, but what we really want to do is create the collaborative connective tissues that allow and enable information flow across the organization. Because if you think about it, most organizations in general anyway, the minute they restructure, the minute they move their teams, the minute they take people from team to team, the minute you change your way of working, you truncate your collaborative connective tissues, and the information flow horizontally and vertically begins to cease, or pockets of it, or siloing of it. Then if you moved into this remote frame, that's really been exacerbated, right? So what we want to do with this particular system is reconstruct those collaborative connective tissues with a remote sense, thinking about how we best enable that information flow to allow us to make those directional decisions as expediently as we can, and to enable the system work to flow, and to enable our people to be happy in what they do, and our leaders in what they do. And to allow that, we have to think about how we leverage that data or that information flow for that dynamic analysis and that decision making. So you heard me talk about directional decisions again. Everything that's done in the frame of an organization, whether it's at the steering layer, the enhancing, the enabling, or the making layer, is about directional decisions. What direction are we going? How are we going to go? And if you think about it, either if you're leaders, or you've worked with leaders, or you've worked with the organizations, how many of those directional decisions were made previously on gut-based decisions, or the highest paid person's opinion in the room, or just purely snap decisions, right? And then when you move in and you put a remote or a hybrid frame over the top of that, the speed of decisioning and directional decision becomes even more important. So we want to leverage that data for that dynamic analysis to allow us to make better directional decision making. So this is the governance system as a whole. There are many modules and many pieces that go with it, but today's a little bit of a taster. And Esther, I think you have something around the thoughts about what we believe for this system.
Yeah, well, I mean, when leaders focus on creating conditions for the system to thrive with strong alignment, organizations are going to do well whether they are remote or hybrid. And we believe that remote governance is a key to creating that workplace. You know, that this way of thinking can guide people to transition to a workplace where, you know, people get work done, and we're respecting the fact that, you know, it's just a challenging place to be when we're, you know, our contexts have collapsed in this way.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. It's really, you know, for me, it's moving from that real mechanistic approach where people are just viewed as cogs in the machine to that humanistic approach where creativity and individualism can flourish. So I guess the next thing here is thinking about what's next, because obviously today we couldn't go through everything that we've created, everything that we've done. It's a taster, and hopefully we've either piqued your interest, we've given you some information or some thoughts about what you're doing or what you've seen or how you might attack different things. But we will be releasing the full pattern release early next year, so look for that. If you really want to understand that, stop by Remote AF's CEO for updates and early releases on that and any of the information. If you really want to get involved, or you want some more information, or you just want to talk about anything that you've seen today, you can reach out to any of the team that are here via LinkedIn or remoteaf.co, or of course estherderby.com. You can investigate how you can become a Remote AF guide at Remote AF as well, because our guides will be the first ones that will get access to the full pattern releases. So with that, we're pretty close to the finish. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Not at this moment.
Good. She's happy. I'm happy. That means we'd like to turn it over to questions and answers. And as I said, I'm going to stop sharing now. Hopefully we come back into the major frame and then we can all see each other. And if you've got some questions, John's going to allow the rest of the team to answer it.
Yeah, there's actually not so much questions, a lot of very rich dialogue happening in the chat, but Anthony did have a question regarding the SEAM model. Yeah, so Anthony, did you want to ask that, or I can read that out for you if you like?
You can read it, it's fine.
Sure. So this one is for Esther, specifically about SEAM. Do you think that the pyramid model might be better described, visualized as a Mobius loop, since top-down reinforces command and control? I love thinking about thinking and use it myself, but I don't show it as a pyramid because I spend much of my time deconstructing CNC.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on how to represent it, and in some ways, I have come to think about it as sort of pace layers that, what changes more rapidly. So the steering decisions in some way change less often than the decisions that people make in the day-to-day. So that part of me says, it's okay to leave it as pace as a pyramid because of the association with pace layers. But I agree, there is a certain implication of hierarchy, and in truth, these decisions do somewhat align with hierarchical levels. That's the people at the top of the organization with the CXX titles are making those sorts of decisions, and generally that's the case. So yeah, I haven't come up with the perfect way to represent it, and when I do, I will be thrilled.
Awesome. And there was actually another question earlier on from Anthony as well. How do you identify and helpfully challenge the governance position of wanting to hold people accountable through managers, in particular, changing the position and mindset of a single neck to choke or a way to identify what's broke?
Dave Martin, I'm going to call you out.
We've sort of been having a bit of a chat about this in the chat. I think a lot of this is down to organisations not making the distinction between management and leadership. I think what we have is a problem around leadership development. We train up managers rather than leaders, and that's the problem. A lot of these behaviours we get is because we're focused so much on management. I've been a leader in organisations before, and those few organisations that gave me any training in that at all, what they trained me in was management. And this is where you get that top down, that one throat to choke, that I need to see what you're doing type of behaviour, rather than leadership behaviour, which is what we really should be trying to build.
Can I chime in here?
You certainly can.
Yeah. So I actually think you can have leaders at all levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I tend to define leadership as, following Jerry Weinberg's definition, which is the ability to adapt the environment so that everybody is empowered to contribute creatively to solving the problems, which says that anything you do to adjust the environment that makes it easier for people to get their work done, whether you're at the top of the organization or whether you're a junior programmer, that's leadership. And I think most effective managers exhibit a heck of a lot of leadership. Right. I think where the problem comes in with leadership is, way back in the family tree, where management, had some assumptions that the people who were doing the work were not intelligent, not educated, and not willing. And in many cases, that may have been true, because if you look at the history of management, it emerged as a profession on sugar plantations and cotton plantations, far long before the railroads, where it's actually attached to. So there's a very extractive mindset. And I think we need to examine that. It makes no sense for knowledge work.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
May I add to that?
Anyone
as well?
wants to know about the research about that, ping me and I'll point you towards it.
Hannes, you said you were going to say something?
Yeah, and I think to answer that question, my take is that sometimes you need to build that intentionally. So we have manager or leaders that sometimes they are not aware of their behaviors and the impact as well. So what kind of we are encouraging over here is understanding where they are and co-design it together, understanding which part needs to change, which parts, especially in regards to the remote setup, needs some adjustment. And I think that remote setup, although we have been there for 2 years and there are organizations that are working in that remote for many years, last 2 years have changed the culture so much that there is a new thinking needs to come to the picture as well. And it is new for many people. So we need to hold each other hand and help to co-create that environment, that setup regarding all those pillars together as well.
Yeah. I think the key there, Farnaz, was where you said intentionally.
Yes.
A lot of management and leadership in organizations, it's just following a set of assumptions that we've had for a long, long time. I think we do need to do some intentional design around leadership, and those organizations that are very intentional about the way that they lead tend to be the ones that lead best.
View of the backlog that's built.
It sounds like you're talking about more relational dynamics than governance dynamics.
Is that a comment for anyone in particular or too funny?
Yeah, no, just the last couple of things. It's, we're talking about governance, which is how we apply across, and this sounds like something we should be, but the way you would apply that is less of it seems as I'm listening, it occurs to me, it feels like that's more of how we relation and build those levels of understanding vis-a-vis empathy, right? Intention through empathy, rather than through setting a governance policy or process in place.
I think they kind of cross over, because if you have the wrong governance in place, then you don't build the relationships you need because the governance gets in the way of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you really need to intentionally design this stuff so that your governance supports the relationships that need to be formed. The definition of leadership I tend to use is one that basically says the art of leadership is the ability to scale relationships.
Yeah. So if I can jump in again, in many organizations, a big chunk of governance is in the way they set up policies that relate to employees. And the assumption behind many of those policies is, people are going to do bad things unless we tell them what not to do. Right. And, in many companies, they end up with policies because as I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Bjarti Bjornes says, someone does something wrong and they put everybody in jail with a policy. So that is part of governance, is the policies that are put in place to constrain employees and tell them what they should do and shouldn't do. And in many organizations, they have so many policies, it's impossible to get anything done without breaking rules, right? You just can't, which is a terrible message to send people. So I tend to think that it's more useful to have a sort of simple rule or set of simple rules that will guide action and interaction and behavior across a wide swath of situations and across, many levels of the organization. So, when you communicate what behavior is desired, what's tolerated, what's not going to be tolerated, if you can do it not with detailed policies that put everybody in jail, but by communicating, how we want to be with each other and what we'll tolerate and not tolerate. I think that shifts a lot of the relational things, but it is part of governance.
And I'll add to that also thinking about that. You have to think about, that's why steering, enabling, enhancing matched with the pillars. When you think about that in concert of the decisions or the policies that you're putting in place, how do they interact through those layers and through those pillars, right? So often those decisions are made thinking that they're the right thing. I won't give HR too hard a time, but it's obviously an easy one to think about. Sometimes we make some of those decisions, but with no actual thought about how that are organized through those layers and through those pillars, how it creates that effect. And that map that we were showing you before, that's part of having that conversation. If you're going to change this, or you need to change this, how do we think about that as leaders? How's that going to directionally affect horizontally and vertically through the organization?
When it comes to policies, like I remember my manager told me this: do not let policy make you stupid. Don't let policy make you stupid. And he says it to all of us every time. And there's a sense of empowerment, of independent decision making. When it comes to staff, he's always encouraged us that, look, we have policy as a standard. However, when the situation arises that needs you to be flexible, you need to make that decision. Otherwise, we're just waiting for people along the chain, and before long, the opportunity is lost or the mistake is going to be worse. So that is what he says to all of us, and it stuck forever in my head.
Yeah, and the policy is one of these things in an organization that tends to just accrete. It's they seldom go back and look at the purpose of the policy. It just becomes the policy. Back in the days of the shuttle program, NASA actually did a review of their getting the shuttle ready policy and removed 220,000 steps. And they all those steps were there just because something had happened once. So they put a policy in place to stop it happening again.
Exactly what I was, you heard me talk about it before. We're saying we need to challenge those controls, and we need to challenge the organizational layers of detritus, right? All those layers that have been built up over that period of time, policy upon policy, that people don't even know why they're doing it. That's the way we always did it. The great Lord of Thwatty, I call it. It was from one of our great friends, Sharon Robson. And she's so right. That's the way we always did it, but we don't know why we did it that way. And so we need to start looking at that. And if you're working into a remote frame, it gets even harder because it exacerbates all the problems that you're looking at for remote and hybrid and trying to move as fast as you possibly can.
I got a question. Like, how do you guys deal with never-ending forms based on those policies? So you have policies, and then form comes after that. And in my previous employment, I told the owner of the company and also the HR and department and operation officer, I said that if you're going to add another policy, you have to remove one policy. So you have to kind of like, say, for example, we count that we have already 50 policies. That's what we have. So the moment you add one more, you have to remove one. And they never like that. How do you handle that?
Finance, what do you have a go at that one?
I think it goes back to the purpose as well. If we kind of refresh our memory from how did things emerge and what was the purpose behind that, and assess it based on the current states we are dealing with, that will be one way of managing and balancing those policy and not end up having a repository of them over the course of many years. And that would be my answer.
A lot of it comes down to just the simple feedback loops. Most policy frameworks are not built with feedback loops built in. So the framework sits there and it never gets reviewed. I think Louise in the chat said, surely the policy framework is reviewed. You'd be surprised at how often they are not reviewed. And I think it comes down to your feedback loops and intentional design. So be intentional about the way your policy framework is evolving, and don't let it become this static thing that just accretes garbage over time.
Yeah.
The other thing about that often, and I'll use audit for an example, I'm not giving them a hard time, it's just a good example, is often the stick gets waved. You have to fill out Form 33 and Form 37 to make an audit happy, and they need this because X. But actually, when you actually bring the audit people closer to the mix and say to them, what do we need to do to satisfy you? They don't Form 33, 37. Actually, what they want you is to have them involved in it so that they know that you're doing the right thing, or they'll give you certain things that they need. So it's really looking at it and saying, again, it's challenging those mechanisms.
And it's really easy to wave around the auditors as a stick. It's, oh, but the auditors. Look, I used to be an auditor years and years ago. I did get better though. And yeah, it's not about, you know, Form 27B/6. It's about, can you show me the evidence that you are doing what the process or the standard says you should be doing? Yeah, when it says you need to be doing design around your stuff, can you show me evidence of design? Not, can you show me a 200-page design template that you've come up with?
I can see we're getting very close to time. I saw a question in there though that I'll throw out to the team. There's one about how do you deal with leaders or managers who are technophobes, given that we're moving into a technological environment, into digitality, right? We're working in our home and we're working in digital. Thoughts, team? I'm going to leave you.
Yeah, it's a hard one, because look, some people are just not going to get it. Look, I spent 2 hours on the phone to my mother a couple of days ago trying to get her COVID vaccination certificate on her phone. There are people of a certain generation who are just not going to get the technology. I think there are other people in that generation who absolutely thrive on that technology. So.
How do you deal with these other leaders who's gonna facilitate what you're talking about? Like being encouraged to put systems together and things, but yet they are the one that struggles with communication with the rest of the team and everything else as well. And so like everything that you do, they have to communicate, but they couldn't even do that.
Yeah.
So as a result, that is half-cocked in terms of a great system, but never implementable.
Yeah, like you still hear lots of stories about, the manager who gets their PA to print out their emails for them so that they can write notes on it to have them type them back in and send them because they just don't know how to send an email. I think these people are getting rarer, but they certainly still exist. And a lot of them are, because of the length of time they've been around, tend to be reasonably senior in the organisation where they can get away with that sort of stuff.
KJ,
So-
sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go, Farnaz.
I go with a very short answer. What I have done previously is that using the language that makes sense to them. And I usually start talking about the impact. Maybe they have difficulty understanding the technology and that language, but they definitely can empathize with the impact of their decisions on others as well. That would be much easier space to deal with them. Sorry, Esther.
Well, actually related to what you said, start with empathy. Just start with empathy about how, for them, it may be a huge change, for someone who, isn't used to dealing with video meetings, who isn't used to dealing with Slack, all these things. It's a big change. So be empathetic. And as Farnaz says, talk about the impact and talk about, what is possible for the rest of the organization, right? I think, the fact that one person is a technophobe doesn't mean the whole organization has to be hampered by that, lack of comfort with technology.
Yeah.
So, impress that you can't hold up the whole organization, and be empathetic and talk about impact and talk about what can enable the entire organization.
And I think that's a good point. What can enable? What I find, and some of the best success I've had in those situations as well, is if you actually get to the root cause of it. A lot of enterprises have about 33, 40 different tools that do the same things, and the crossovers, and no wonder they get confused, because like I've been living in the digital environment. I've been working with internet since 1998, building websites, right? So I understand this. And even I walk in an organization, sometimes I go, which channel do you communicate? Oh, well, sometimes we're on Slack, sometimes we're on this one, sometimes we're on that one, sometimes we're on that one. No wonder leaders are going, brain space. So sometimes it's also taking a moment to simplify.
Yeah.
Be really clear. So, you know, those guide rails I talked about before and the teams, it's working with them and working with the leaders to say, what are the channels that we're going to use to communicate for these things? Because that starts to pare it away, and it does take some of that technology. It's not always going to solve it, but it's certainly when you simplify it, because I can understand if you're sitting at a layer and there's a million different tools, how do you get that message out? John, I think that's our time.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question to have wrapped up on. So just wanted to thank both Esther, Tony, and also Farnaz and Dave for sharing all that joyous wisdom and the fruits of their labor over the past couple of months. Can't wait to see the full version early next year. And of course, also thank you to everyone for coming along to the event. It's been absolutely fantastic and a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up. Really appreciate it.